It was another time of turmoil, of progress and resistance in this cycle we live, of hope and of fear in this cycle we keep going through. It was March 7th, 1965. 600 African-American citizens lined up behind John Lewis, leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for a march from Selma to Montgomery. It began. They were protesting for voters' rights, against the slaying of who? Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jackson was a young local man. He was a veteran. He'd been shot by a state trooper when they broke up a rally in nearby Marion, Alabama. You know, back then, that wasn't newsworthy. There were no cell phones to broadcast what had happened around the world. It received no coverage. However, the release 3 days later of two white Unitarian Universalist ministers, Gordon Gibson and Ira Baylock, and a white lay Catholic theologian, that made headlines. Sunday morning, the march, when the protesters reached the William Pettus Bridge, they were what? You know what happened. They were tear gassed by the Alabama state troopers, and then the local vigilantes swept in on horseback, swinging batons, they charged. That was recorded. Soon the world knew. At 4:57 a.m. Monday morning, Martin Luther King Jr. dispatched a telegram to all faith traditions to send clergy to join the Citizens' Selma March to Selma in another march. Among those who he sent it to were UUA President Dana McLean Greeley. And among those who responded to the call were James Reeb, Orloff Miller, Clark Olson. Jim Reeb had worked in Washington but had wanted to immerse himself fully in the African-American community. He was leading a housing program for the American Friends Service Committee in Boston, living in largely black Dorchester, Massachusetts, where his children enrolled in predominantly black African-American public schools. He was immersed, committed to, he's actually among cadre of young ministers committed to grassroots empowerments of African-Americans in the urban scene. That Sunday evening, Reeb and his wife Marie had dinner with Ted Webb. Ted Webb was the UUA Mass Bay executive director. Together they watched in horror the newsreel of the attack. Orloff Miller, the UUA director of UU College Centers, and his wife Mary Jane were having dinner with an interracial couple. They too watched the slaughter on TV. So Monday morning, when the call came to Miller, who was on the 6th floor of 25 Beacon Street, he rushed down to meet with Homer Jack. Homer Jack was director of social responsibility for the UUA. Homer Jack handed Orloff the telegram. In the margin, Dana had written, "See if Homer will alert some of our men to go," and he meant men, "and tell Ted. Soon they were working the phones, and UUs were preparing to go, as were Catholics, though they knew not to call the bishop. I don't know if you know that. They knew they would never get permission. Catholics just went against all protocol. Jews, Episcopalians who also should have called their bishop and did not. Lutherans and Methodists. Now, today, we assume that the outpouring of support and the rush to Selma was because of the righteousness of the cause, right? And the magnitude of the injustice. But I have to say that doesn't really fully explain the response. Of course it was because of the cause, but it was relationships that compelled them to go, the connection of one person to another. Martin Luther King Jr. and Homer Jack had known one another since 1954, when Homer Jack and two other Unitarian ministers had been among the first to go south to support the Montgomery bus boycott. That summer, Jack preached that very summer in Dr. King's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Then in 1957, they both went to Ghana to celebrate Ghanaian independence. Jack visited King in the hospital in New York City after King was stabbed. MLK also knew UU Gene Reeves. He actually called Reeves and said, "I need you to come, Gene." It was Teb Webb who called Jim Reeb. They'd had dinner with one another the night before and asked him to go. It was probably Greeley who called Brad Greeley, because Brad Greeley was Dana McCain Greeley's nephew. And Brad Greeley then called his colleague in Concord, Arthur Jellis, and he asked, "Shall we go?" And they went. And Orloff Miller, who was the director of the Office of College Centers, well, he called Jack Taylor. They had been classmates. Indeed, King, Taylor, Miller, Reeves had all attended Boston Unitarian School of Theology together. You see the pattern? No accident here. For others, actually, it wasn't a matter of being called, but it was a matter of relationship. They were sent. David Johnson in Bloomington, Indiana, arrived at church for a meeting, was told by the board, "You're going to represent us, and here is the money." By midnight, he and another church member were in the air, flying to Alabama. And Johnson was not the only one sent. Prior to the conclusion of the march to Montgomery, the members of the congregation in Park Forest, Illinois, challenged their minister, David Bumbaugh, to go. David says this: "They listened to my reasons for not going and informed me that they had an airplane ticket and asked me would I use it. I knew that this decision would shape my life, and I said yes. And along with 4 or 5 members of the congregation, we flew to Alabama together." You see the bridge? Relationships. I mean, what do you do when someone says, "Go"? Go for us. Go with us. It's about being in relationship. So I ask you this morning, with whom are you in relationship? Who is it that might call you and say, "Shall we go?" And you would say, "Yes." So too often we credit the righteousness of the cause. We make believe it's about an ideological commitment, about right belief, about moral courage, but that does not explain what happened. What do you do when your friend calls and says, "I'm going. Join me"? The circumstances for Clark Olson, who was in Berkeley, and Clark Olson, who actually was walking beside, Reed was on the curb, which is why he got hit. Then Orloff Miller, then Clark Olson. And the 3 of them were then attacked, right? But his decision to go. Well, actually, he heard King's announcement, or the call on the radio. And by the time he got home, and he's busy thinking and calculating, and he doesn't figure out how he can get from California there, and he doesn't have the money for a ticket anyhow. By the time he got home, congregation members had called unbidden and left a message that they would pay for his ticket. What happened? What was the bridge? What is it are you thinking about? Is this? What I want you to think about is this. With whom are you in relationship? I'm going to keep coming back to that refrain. With whom are you in relationship? Who is it that might help you get there? Who is it that might call and say, "Shall we go?" Who is it that might call that you'd have to say, "Yes, I'm coming"? So I need to tell you something else about the many who went to Selma to cross the bridge, and they really didn't know what awaited them. So Clark Olson and Bill Jones. I don't know if Bill Jones became the foremost black humanist theologian. Was a UU humanist theologian. Well, they built a close relationship when they were student ministers in Wellesley, Mass. And Gene Reeves, well, Gene Reeves knew Martin Luther King Jr. from BU, but then when he was here at Emory, Gene worked with Coretta King right here. And Jack Taylor, you know Howard Thurman? Yes, some of you, renowned Afro-American preacher. Jack Taylor was Howard Thurman's assistant when Thurman was the dean of March Chapel at BU. And in 1942, Homer Jack had been among the founders of the Congress of Racial Equality. He knew literally the entire leadership of the Civil Rights Movement. And then there was Fred Lipp. Fred Lipp had just graduated from Meadville Lombard and felt called to go, and a board member told him going might cost him his job, which he had just started. But Fred had attended Tuskegee Institute during his junior year of college. And Fred went anyhow. And Viola Liuzzo, she was not only a member of the NAACP, but her best friend was Sarah Evans, a black woman. Theirs were not casual relationships to African Americans. I digress just a moment. Exactly the same thing happened with equal marriage. When LGBTQ people came out and we realized that our lives and our love for LGBTQ people were throughout our lives. That's what moved that so quickly. This wasn't about someone else any longer. This was about people we had intimate, caring relationships with. That's why that changed, literally felt somewhat on a dime, though I know it wasn't. So when I ask you today about whom are you in relationship, gang, I'm not talking about who's already here. I'm talking about actually who's not here. With whom do you socialize? What does your friendship network look like? Is their class, their culture, their race different than your own? To whom have you built bridges? Or to whom would you want to? Do you want to build bridges? What relationships would make a difference in your life? What relationships would transform your life? Flying into Alabama from California, Clark Olson arrived late, but caught up with his colleagues, and after dinner he was walking beside Jim Reeb and Olaf Miller when they were attacked. If Clark was here today, if you asked Clark Olson today why he went, I know exactly what Clark would say. I decided to go. I decided to go. So the why that gets offered later as an explanation of why people went for going, I have to tell you, it's a guess, it's an approximation, it's a hunch, it's a rationalization, and is always secondary to the decision itself. It's about deciding to go. It's about showing up. It's about, I have to say, gang, it's not about being super deliberative or careful or rational. It's actually about feeling compelled. Now, I cannot know what caused any of you to go, but I know now, actually I talk about right now, we will feel called to go. I don't know exactly what it's going to mean. We can't know exactly, but we know our values are at stake. So I don't know for you if that's going to mean what? The needs of immigrants, the needs of refugees. I don't know for you if that's going to mean violence reduction. Is that going to be the environment? I don't know. Is it going to be mass incarceration? Disability rights, LGBTQ rights, I don't know. Is it going to be state-sanctioned violence against Native women? Michael Brown. Walter Scott. Eric Courtney Harris. Laquan McDonald. Cedric Chapman. Philando Castile. Freddie Gray. Tanisha Anderson. Christian Taylor. Yes, Black Lives Matter. Muslim lives matter. Hispanic lives matter too. You know what it's about? It's a metaphor. Don't get too confused. It's not about everybody matters, but it's a metaphor for the dispossessed. It's a metaphor for the marginalized. It's a metaphor for those society discounts and oppresses. That's what it means. That's who it is we need to stand up for and with. So what I know is when there's a bridge, when there's a connection, when there's a meaningful relationship exists, that's what compels you to act. Without that pull, well, I have to tell you, frankly, it's to be remain an observer. Yeah, of course you're outraged. Of course you're dismayed, but I'd say more often we'd rather gesticulate rather than act. Now, I cannot know when Selma will arise again, and Selma will not arise again, but other things are arising at this moment. None of us can know exactly how this will play out, but we know that we need to be there. But I can tell you something else. We have been there. I can give you a dozen UUs who helped found NAACP pre-branches, chapters of the Urban League. In the South, they started human relations councils. I can tell you another dozen or more who served on the local boards. So whether institutional or personal, they had relationships to African Americans. And I can tell you others, our colleagues now in St. Louis and Baltimore who were involved in Black Lives Matters. See, there's this bridge. And when the time comes, the decision to go is automatic. So my second question for you is, what's getting in the way of making that kind of commitment? Yes, it takes a little courage to step out of our comfort zones which we have built actually into fortresses. It takes some courage because, if we're honest, the unknown is scary. Venturing into unfamiliar settings, we inevitably are going to feel uneasy, off balance, situations that are beyond our controls, rules of which we're not certain about. Of course, they make us anxious. Of course, we'd rather avoid them. Doubt eats at us. That's the way it's going to be if you do this. And it's good. And it's important. And it's how we learn. Being careful and cautious and hiding our vulnerability is not a recipe for change and transformation. Why do we come to church? And I know this is what Anthony preaches. It's to be transformed. But for that to happen, you have to commit. You have to step forward. You have to engage. And then you have to let the awkwardness and the anxiety, yes, take charge and feel them. And then as you build relationships, despite that sense of awkwardness, despite your trepidation, as you build those relationships, what happens? They reach in and they change you. That's where you change. And in that change, you turn what? Difference into dialogue, confusion into understanding, distance into camaraderie. But you have to stop making excuses and engage. Act instead of lament. Take risk. You can, because why can you do that? Because you have the support of what? This beloved community. With community as a resource, the feelings, yes, of trepidation and reluctance, that sense of vulnerability, the doubts, of course you have doubts, and the dilemmas you will face, and the ways you'll get wounded, and I guarantee you, you will be wounded. But given a supportive, beloved community, they can be transformed. The wounds are transformed and can be used to heal oneself and the world. So, with whom are you in relationship? A relationship that would transform you, a relationship that would compel you to take these risks. So, first Sunday in December, it was two years ago, I was preaching in Amsterdam at the NUF, that's the Northern Unitarian Fellowship, and during the sharing of joys and concerns, an older Euro-American male who'd lived in Holland since the 80s, Bill, got up and lit a candle for Ferguson and Michael Brown. And I was surprised, actually, and I was touched. And when I told him after the service, he said, "My 3 grandsons are black." Of course. You know, when someone's that close, the risks no longer matter. In the context of relationship, risks are completely secondary. When the other becomes your sister, your brother, your friend, your grandsons, you feel compelled to act. And the wider your circle of friends, the broader your relationships, the more often that's going to happen to you, because the boundaries of your heart will have expanded. Yes, and because we act. Why do we act? Because we care. Because we care. Because we love. So the question is, with whom are you in relationship? Who is it you might come to love? And what of your relationship to yourself? Place yourself in situations where friendships can evolve. That's all I'm calling for. Nothing big. Just place yourself in situations where friendships and relationships can grow and evolve. Do that, and when you come to act for justice, you will not be acting for others, which is what we often do, but with them and for yourself. The outpouring of support and the rush to Selma was, of course, about the righteousness of the cause and the magnitude of the injustice. But more important was what preceded that moment of decision. For those who lived in Selma, relationships gave them courage and strength. For those who came, relationships compelled them to go. All we're talking about is the connection of one person to another. That's what compelled them to go. Placing the cause first, I will guarantee you, will lead you astray. Ideological commitments certainly will, because what do? They prize right belief over right relationship. No, not by any means necessary, for the end will always be a manifestation of the means. But being in a relationship and working together to address a problem is different. Somehow it creates a space, a creative, shared, I hope non-ideological synergy from which, yes, relationship grows and alternatives spring forth, and you can find solidarity in working in common cause. And that's what happened for a time in Selma in 1965. I want to say it happened again with equal marriage, and it can happen again today. Such a commitment is fueled by a yearning for meaning in our lives. And I actually better turn that around. It's actually your need to make meaning of your life. Conscience urges us forward, for we are dreamers, dreaming of a better, more just tomorrow. We still dream. Yes, we still dream. Whenever my life ends, when I am ash, or in the moments as I face death, I want the comfort of knowing this, that I poured out my time and my energy and my substance and my life for what I valued, for what we value, and those I loved. It's about being in love with one another, and being in love with oneself, and being in love with this world to which we are wed. Being in love, we take whatever risks are necessary. This is what living fully, deeply, and with integrity demands. Not standing on the side of love, but being compelled by love. Amen. Blessed be Ashe.